February 1945. A cold wind pushed through the shattered streets of a country that once promised order and certainty. Inside a dimly lit office in the heart of Nazi power, Joseph Goebbels sat hunched over a pile of documents. They were not propaganda circulars, but reports from the Sicherheitsdienst, intelligence on the mood of the nation. The pages told the same story again and again. Exhaustion, despair, a yearning for an end to the killing. One line caught Goebbels' eye and would later be copied into his diary. A simple, almost casual confession from a woman in Essen standing in a bread line. She said she would welcome Americans into her town if they brought peace. Goebbels wrote it down not as an isolated act of compassion, but as evidence of the collapse of a myth. The myth that the Führer was synonymous with Germany's future, that defeat was unthinkable. What did Hitler, the man who had built that myth, do when he learned his people were pleading for peace? The answer is not what most expect. If you want more deep dive history like this, hit subscribe. There's more coming that unpacks how decisions at the top rippled down into ruin. To understand why that simple admission in Essen mattered, you have to rewind. The image of unstoppable Germany began to crack in the winter of 1942-43 at Stalingrad. The defeat there was not merely a military setback. It punctured the aura of infallibility the regime had cultivated. Soldiers who had been invincible on parade grounds were now corpses in snow. The home front felt it like a shift in the weather. The certainty of victory thawed into fear. As the Allies turned weapons into weather, the war's most devastating storms fell on German cities. Hamburg in the summer of 1943 became a furnace. The operation known to the RAF as Operation Gomorrah produced what survivors would call a firestorm. Roofs peeled off like skin, streets flowed with smoke, and people who had sought shelter in cellars were suffocated by flames and heat. The reports filed afterward recorded whole neighborhoods reduced to skeletons of brick and twisted metal. Casualty figures and the precise human toll are recorded in various documents. Some sources give numbers, others give only the raw accounts of ash and rubble. The sensory reality, the smell of burning, the sound of churches collapsing, the sight of refugees moving like a river through ruined landscape, is what those reports aim to convey to the leadership at the time. Dresden, a winter later, repeated the pattern in a different register. A city celebrated for its art and Baroque beauty was turned into a smoking ruin during a series of Allied raids that left streets unrecognizable and scores of civilians among the dead. In every destroyed neighborhood and every refugee column, confidence in the regime drained away. When men returned home to basements and ashes, they carried more than grief. They carried a hesitancy toward the ideology that had once promised deliverance. The propaganda machine rattled. Goebbels, who measured hearts as carefully as he measured paper circulation, reported a shift from defiant enthusiasm to desperate seeking. People asking if the killing could stop. The intelligence Goebbels received was not abstract. SD agents dispatched across cities compiled testimony from everyday Germans. Mothers, laborers, clerks, and the old men who had survived the First World War and now stared at the Second. In the notes were phrases like, "No more," "I only want peace," and the particular sting of humiliation when a pregnant woman said she might be grateful to the enemy if that enemy just stopped the bombing. These were not idle sympathies. They were active moral judgments being formed at the street level, that the regime had failed to protect its people. How do authoritarian systems react when their foundational myth falters? Some leaders confront the evidence, adapt tactics, and seek a path to preserve lives. Others retreat into dogma and rage. In Hitler's case, the record shows a steady withdrawal from the physical reality of destruction, followed by a turn toward punitive, almost vindictive solutions. He avoided the visible embodiments of defeat. He refused to visit badly bombed cities. According to contemporary accounts recorded in ministerial memoirs and diaries, he explained that seeing the devastation upset him. Whether that was genuine physical aversion, political calculation, or a mixture of both, the practical effect was the same. He kept his distance from the human consequences of the war. Between Goebbels' desk and Hitler's refusal to face the bombed-out streets stood a menagerie of gatekeepers and bureaucratic buffers. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and enforcer, controlled access with a combination of administrative routine and personal malice. Important information, letters, deputations, reports, passed through his office and was filtered before reaching the Führer. It was not only a matter of protecting Hitler from bad news. It was institutional insulation that allowed a leader to live in a curated reality. When the people cried out, their voices were muffled before ever entering the room where the man in brown trousers paced and listened through earphones. Yet the world beyond the bunker did not pause while bureaucrats argued over who should tell the truth. The war machine was failing in measurable ways. Albert Speer, Minister for Armaments and War Production, sat down in January 1945 to lay bare the technical collapse of Germany's capacity to sustain the fight. Speer's memorandum, written with the unmistakable precision of an engineer who had once believed in modernizing industry for the state, described dwindling output, shattered factories, the logistical impossibility of replacing munitions at the required rate. He did not appeal in sentimental terms. He presented a ledger of capability and a choice. Without significant change, the war effort would disintegrate. Speer's report was not merely a technical plea. It carried with it an implicit moral question. Were the continuations of certain policies worth the lives being lost and the cities being emptied? He expected that confronting the Führer with facts, production curves, transport interruptions, refugee columns eating into the labor force, might open a pragmatic path to saving what remained of Germany and its civilians. The reply he received, as Speer later recorded and as others corroborated, was chilling. According to Speer's memoirs, Hitler responded not with a reconsideration or a call to protect civilians, but with a logic that inverted responsibility. If defeat was inevitable, then denying the enemy any benefit from German industrial capacity became a perverse honor. Speer reports that Hitler argued it would be better to destroy than to surrender, to leave nothing of value to the victors. That sentiment, presented by a man charged with keeping factories running, was not an abstract ideological flourish. It translated into orders and possibilities. If a leader prefers destruction over humiliation, he is one step away from commanding ruin. You can read Speer's account and see why his tone in later years oscillated between technical regret and moral horror. He recounts being trapped between the imperative to save infrastructure and the Führer's growing appetite for punitive annihilation. This was not mere military strategy. It was politico-moral logic, a willingness to reduce your own country to ashes rather than accept accountability. The implications were immediate. If a leader willfully chooses to destroy his own resources, what prevents him from considering the citizens who depend on those resources expendable? At the same time that men like Speer argued for preservation, the bureaucracy produced orders that hinted at a ruthlessness beyond military necessity. Documents emerged that authorized scorched earth measures, plans to deny the advancing enemy the resources of conquered territory. The rationale in military terms can be traced. Deny the enemy use of railways, bridges, industrial centers. But when such plans shift from tactical retreat to wholesale demolition, the line between strategy and vengeance blurs. For those reading the orders and hearing the pronouncements, there was a discernible change. The war was ceasing to be about strategic advantage and taking on the tone of punishment. Back on the street level, the consequences were already visible. Refugees from the eastern provinces moved en masse, dragging what little they could carry through winter roads clogged with mud and confusion. In one common report the SD collected, a refugee column passed through a town where the residents had already been displaced by bombing. The newcomers and the locals eyed each other with a mix of solidarity and rivalry, each fearing that resources would not be enough. Food became a bargaining chip, fuel a currency. The regime's ability to supply basic needs waned as infrastructure and transport networks suffered repeated strikes and targeted destruction. Again and again, the intelligence spoke not just of scarcity, but of a moral exhaustion. People asking whether the state they had served still stood for anything worth dying for. That exhaustion was not merely an emotional state. It had political consequences. Men who had once cheered at rallies now murmured in pubs and basements. Women in queues compared scars. Clergy whispered in confessionals. The cumulative effect was a delegitimization of authority from the ground up. In some locales, civilians even welcomed advancing Allied units because, cruelly simply, the bombing stopped when the enemy's control replaced the regime's reach. Such gestures, a tossed bouquet, a lowered head, a handshake, were small acts that communicated a profound political truth. The supposed unity of Volk and Führer had been broken. Officials like Goebbels understood the danger. Propaganda could not simply paper over the smell of burning timber or erase the sight of children with frostbitten fingers. So the apparatus responded with two complementary strategies: intensify the rhetoric of defiance and increase the distance between leader and consequence. The first aimed to redirect anger outward toward the enemy and scapegoats. The second insulated the man in power from seeing what his orders produced. Both, strategically combined, allowed the regime to continue even as its tangible base shrank. It is essential at this point to avoid simplistic causality. Leaders do not always act in single, monolithic ways. They are pressed by advisors, terrified by possibility, and constrained by political theater. Yet a pattern emerges clearly in the sources. As defeat became more likely, Hitler's choices showed an increased willingness to weaponize destruction as an ethical response. This is not merely the rhetoric of no surrender, but an ethic that privileges ideological purity over human survival. Those who warned him of the consequences, ministers, officers, technical experts, did so in language of utility. They argued their case with production tables and maps. Some, like Speer, sought to save both the material and the people who depended on it. Speer's position was a narrow bridge between engineering and conscience. He believed in stabilizing production to preserve life by maintaining civilian industry. His memorandum was a professional appeal. Keep the railways so that food can move. Protect factories so that employment and shelter persist. When he met resistance, he interpreted it in two ways: as the product of Hitler's ideological stubbornness and as the result of a bureaucracy increasingly willing to follow destructive orders. Then came a moment that would crystallize the divergence between preservation and punishment. In early 1945, Hitler signed what later sources would call the Nero Decree, an order that, in essence, instructed the destruction of German infrastructure to deny its use to the Allies. The full scope and phrasing of that decree are preserved in the records. The order itself is available in primary documents. It represented the logical endpoint of the equation Hitler seemed to be advancing. If defeat is inevitable, then value must be destroyed rather than conceded. For ministers like Speer, the decree was an outrage. For many military commanders, it was impractical. For civilians, it was an additional sentence tacked onto a life already ravaged by bombing and shortages. The decree forced a moral choice on the state apparatus: obey and accelerate ruin, or find ways to subvert and preserve what remained. What followed would tell us as much about avenues of resistance inside authoritarian systems as it would about the leader who issued the order. Even before the decree could be implemented fully, smaller gestures of subversion and refusal emerged. Technical managers began to delay demolitions, to misplace demolition charges, or to argue that certain bridges and plants were indispensable to civilian life and could not be sensibly destroyed. These acts were not grand rebellions. They were quiet, technical manipulations in the face of a perverse command. They also exposed a truth. The state's machinery, once turned toward destruction, could be turned again by the choices of those asked to implement orders. Yet the man at the apex remained unrepentant. The reports that had begun at Goebbels' desk, accounts of a nation asking for peace, continued to move up the chain. What Hitler allegedly told those seeking peace, according to multiple recorded accounts, ceases to be comfortable reading. Speer's summarized recollection is blunt. Hitler framed the situation in binary moral terms and expressed a willingness to see the country reduced if that was the price of denying the enemy. Goebbels, in his diary, recorded the depth of civilian despair, but also the regime's escalating rhetoric of sacrifice and resistance. To put the stakes plainly, when your leader frames the surrender of his people's livelihoods and infrastructure as preferable to the humiliation of defeat, the moral axis of command shifts. Protection of life becomes subordinate to a symbolic idea of honor maintained only through the maintenance of control. And if control is impossible, then the preferred response becomes annihilation. That is a political logic with specific human consequences. It explains why, as spring 1945 approached, large segments of Germany felt abandoned by the leadership that had once claimed to be its guardian. The tension between pragmatic preservation and punitive destruction created a series of flashpoints in the administration. Technical men like Speer made modest, rational appeals. Propagandists like Goebbels tried to manage popular morale through words that grew more extreme as reality shrank. Personalities like Bormann tightened the funnel of information. And at the center, Hitler, physically remote from many of the ruined sites, articulated a theory of ruin that, according to primary accounts, was almost theological in its intensity. Better to cleanse by fire than to surrender to the enemy's gaze. At this point, the narrative breaks open into two paths that would collide in the months to come. On one hand, covert acts of obstruction aimed at preserving bridges, factories, and lives. On the other, explicit orders and a leader's rhetoric that seemed to call for scorched earth measures. If the Nazi leadership's inner conflicts are to be understood as moral drama, they are a drama of responsibility. Who bears responsibility when a state willingly orders the destruction of its own capacity and people? When the first tremors of the Eastern advance rolled toward the Reich, the question was no longer theoretical. It would be answered by specific orders and the choice of subordinate officials to obey or resist. Before those choices would be fully revealed on the ground, another critical episode crystallized the difference between diagnosis and remedy. Speer, constrained by the need to preserve both industry and lives, prepared to make a last technical case to save what could be saved. He set out enumerating rail links that must remain intact, factories whose preservation would keep civilians fed, and harbors that could serve as lifelines. He offered concrete alternatives to the kind of blanket demolition Hitler seemed inclined to prefer. In delivering that memorandum, Speer expected the rational calculus to win out. Instead, the response he received, recorded by Speer and echoed in other contemporary accounts, revealed how far Hitler had detached from practical governance. According to Speer, Hitler's answer was not logistical. It was moralistic and punitive. Speer wrote that Hitler suggested that if defeat came, then the country should be left with nothing. The enemy should be denied its prize, even if that meant condemning Germans to further suffering. Whether Hitler used the exact phrasing reported in memoirs or spoke in broader terms, the thrust was unmistakable. He was willing to see his own country pay an extreme price rather than yield. That exchange, a technical memorandum of preservation met by a leader's embrace of destruction, marks a crucial hinge in the late war chronology. It is where choices that had been simmering in the government became activated as policy. It is also where the question at the heart of this narrative becomes unavoidable. When Germans sought peace, did their leader answer with mercy, strategy, or contempt? The recorded responses and orders that followed suggest an answer that chills. The leadership, or at least its central figure, articulated a preference that placed ideological purity and punitive logic above the preservation of civilian life. What followed that memorandum set events onto a course that would determine the fate of millions. Plans for demolition were drawn, resisted, and in some cases carried out. The social fabric, already threadbare from years of deprivation, was tested to breaking. Refugee columns lengthened. Bombed cities became repositories not only of physical ruin, but of a severed covenant between ruler and ruled. For those who had once believed in the Führer as guardian, the emerging pattern of word and deed betrayed that trust. We arrive then at the precipice. Speer's account, Goebbels' diary entries, and the SD reports collectively tell a story of a populace asking for relief and a leadership increasingly inclined to treat that request as betrayal. They show ministers and technicians pleading for preservation, and a leader brooking no compromise. The human anecdotes, the woman in Essen who would welcome Americans for peace, the families in Hamburg who found their homes gone, the citizens of Dresden who woke to a city turned to ash, are the moral anchors of this account. They make abstract decisions real. When choices about railways, factories, and bridges are framed as matters of honor or humiliation, they become decisions about whether lives will be saved or deliberately sacrificed. What does it mean for a nation when its highest authority prefers destruction to admission of failure? How do people reconcile love of country with the knowledge that the country's leader is ordering its devastation? These are not rhetorical questions, but historical ones, and the answers are written in the orders and the diaries. In the documents available to historians, the ministers' memoranda, the diaries of propagandists, and the recorded conversations of those who survived the regime, a pattern of contemptuous resolve emerges. Hitler's responses to pleas for peace were not only refusals, they were expressions of a logic that equated capitulation with moral annihilation. And yet, even within this grim arc, there were embers of resistance. Small, technical, human choices that subverted wholesale ruin. Engineers who delayed demolitions, officials who fudged reports, factory managers who argued for the preservation of goods for civilian use. Their acts complicate the picture. They show that inside the mechanisms of power, there were agents who recognized the moral dimensions of their work. Those acts would matter. Answering that requires following the administrative thread down into the field, tracking who sabotaged orders, which bridges were saved, and where the decrees were enforced ruthlessly. It requires moving from the memoranda and diaries into the streets and the cellars, into the hands of engineers and the mouths of refugees. Only by tracing those pathways will we see how Hitler's reported response to the plea for peace translated into concrete outcomes for the German people, and whether any institutions or individuals could, in the end, blunt the edge of a leader's appetite for destruction. To follow the paper trail into the field, historians trace the administrative threads down to the men with wire cutters and detonators, to depot managers with logbooks and foremen with lists of spare parts. In those lists, the abstract argument about honor and humiliation met the material facts of life. A bridge was either still standing to carry coal and bread, or it was rubble that left a train full of evacuees stranded. The Nero Decree did not descend as a single dramatic thunderclap. It arrived as a bureaucratic cascade of orders, annexes, timetables, and demolition instructions. Implementing it required thousands of hands and the reluctant cooperation of technicians who knew what blowing a culvert or burning a warehouse would mean for ordinary people who had already lost almost everything. What followed was not uniform obedience. In towns and districts up and down the Reich, the decree encountered a different practical ethic. The ethic of preservation that arises when someone is ordering you to destroy the very things your neighbors still need to survive. Engineers delayed. Demolition experts misplaced fuses. Local commanders argued that a bridge was still needed to evacuate wounded, or to move grain, or simply because its loss would strand a whole region in winter. These were not heroic uprisings, so much as bureaucratic foot-dragging, the kind of minute falsifications and excuses that cumulatively prevented wholesale annihilation. Albert Speer later emphasized these acts of obstruction as a decisive factor in averting the full logic of the Nero decree, and many contemporary reports confirm that where local officials chose to resist, whole pieces of infrastructure survived. Resistance, however, was uneven. In pockets where fanatical functionaries held sway, or where communications had broken down, sabotage orders were carried out. Rail yards were wrecked, factories gutted, and warehouses set ablaze. For the civilians who remained, such enforced ruin was a second catastrophe layered on top of bombing and starvation. A family that had survived an air raid watched its town's last factory be torched on orders from a command center miles away. That image, the deliberate burning of the means of survival, crystallized the fear that had been building ever since the SD reports filtered up to Goebbels. The state had turned against its own people, or at least some of its leaders had ceased to see difference between enemy and citizen. At the center of this fracturing lay a simple political fact. Hitler, physically separated from much of what unfolded by his inner circle and his own reluctance to confront visible devastation, increasingly substituted symbolic gestures for governance. Inside the bunker in Berlin, as Allied armies tightened their ring, directives were issued with the cadence of ritual and the detachment of a man speaking across a map rather than from a city street. Orders called for counterattacks that had no logistical basis. They demanded that units hold ground despite encirclement. They forbade retreat and, with that interdiction, condemned soldiers and civilians to stand where they could do little but wait. Reports from the front filtered in, men exhausted, command structures in disarray, supply lines severed, and were countered with a language of defiance. The propaganda apparatus amplified these calls to sacrifice. Goebbels, who had once confidently equated German destiny with the Führer's will, recorded the growing contradiction. The rhetoric demanded endurance, while the material reality offered nothing but collapse. The cognitive dissonance was decisive. When the call to fight becomes untethered from any plausible means of success, obedience rests on ideology alone. And when ideology becomes the only currency, those who cannot or will not comply become, in the leader's calculus, liabilities. This ideological hardening extended to policy regarding civilians. Requests to evacuate certain populations, to prioritize food distribution, or to make pragmatic concessions to stem the suffering were sometimes dismissed as treasonous or as evidence of defeatism. Testimonies compiled by the SD and later recounted in diaries show that petitions from towns to save their bridges or spare their factories were treated not as pragmatic pleas, but as signs of collapsing will. In some cases, orders explicitly discouraged mass evacuations, either because moving people en masse would clog roads needed for military movement, or because the leadership feared that allowing civilians to disperse would further erode the discipline of those still under arms. The practical effect was chilling, a refusal to adapt humanitarian policy in the name of abstract strategic or moral reasoning, with civilians caught in the middle. As Berlin became the focal point of decision-making in April 1945, the gap between orders and survival widened into a moral abyss. Hitler's circle grew smaller. Loyalty became a kind of tunnel vision. Martin Bormann, whose role had long been to shield Hitler from inconvenient facts, exerted fierce control over information. Decisions that might have offered relief were filtered, delayed, or reinterpreted to fit the prevailing dogma. Goebbels intensified the drumbeat of sacrifice. Speer, increasingly isolated, worked to preserve what he could with the technical levers still at his disposal. The interior of power had become a sealed environment, in which practical pleas, the pleas that sprang from the rubble of Hamburg or the ashes of Dresden, were met with a logic that equated concession with contamination. Then, in the bunker itself, reality crossed into the personal. Hitler's final months were marked by a retreat into ritual, by bursts of fury, and by paranoid inventories of betrayal. The final testament he dictated, an explicit document that would be published after his death, read like an act of repudiation. In that testament, he blamed Jews, Bolsheviks, and what he called treacherous leaders for the catastrophe, essentially refusing to accept responsibility himself. Accounts of the document and of its tone make clear that at the very end, Hitler remained committed to a narrative of external betrayal rather than self-accountability. Those words mattered not only for their content but for their effect. They were a last public artifact of a leadership that had chosen to scapegoat others while its people lay starving and homeless. April 30, 1945, ended the person who had made those choices. Hitler took his own life in the Führer bunker as Soviet forces closed on central Berlin. The suicide was the literal consummation of a refusal to answer to defeat or to face trial or to allow a public accounting of responsibility. It left a vacuum of command and a nation that would be occupied, divided, and forced to reckon with the consequences of choices made in rooms like that one. Within days, Germany's chain of command unraveled. On May 8, formal surrender followed, and the war that had consumed a continent and produced untold suffering was officially at an end. How many had died on both sides of the conflict? How many homes were lost? How many were left without livelihood? Those figures are recorded in numerous places and vary by source. For the purposes of this narrative and where specific numbers are not supplied, indefinido is used to mark uncertainty. The human picture, however, is unmistakable. Millions displaced, cities in ruins, and a moral landscape profoundly altered. How do we square the central chilling promise of this piece, "What did Hitler tell Germans when they sought peace?" with the documentary record? The answer must be given with precision because the title invites shock. It is not, strictly speaking, a single verbal exchange between Hitler and a representative delegation that can be quoted in full from the primary sources. Instead, the message that reached the population and their supplicants, the message that comes through in diaries, memoranda, and orders, was a consistent pattern. When faced with the possibility of being forced to concede, Hitler articulated a preference for denying any prize to the victor, even if denying that prize meant destroying his own nation's economic base and making life impossibly harder for its civilian population. According to Albert Speer's memoirs and his memorandum exchanges in January 1945, Hitler expressed in effect that the option of leaving infrastructure intact in the event of defeat was unacceptable. Better nothing than surrender. That principle underpinned the Nero Decree and the logic of scorched earth that followed. Goebbels' diary entries confirm the depth of civilian despair and the regime's rhetorical insistence on sacrifice. The cumulative record is not limited to an abstraction. It translated into concrete orders, into administrative pressure to carry out destruction, and into a political culture where pleas for mercy were treated as signs of betrayal. Put plainly, when ordinary Germans begged for peace in the streets and in letters, the leadership's documented response reflected contempt and a punitive logic. Those seeking relief were sometimes labeled defeatist and their appeals bureaucratically suppressed. At higher levels, the response that emerged from Hitler's calculations, recorded by insiders, was not a program of negotiated settlement or civilian protection, but an embrace of a ruinous, better-to-leave-nothing ethic. That, historically, is the content of what Hitler said when the people asked for an end to suffering. A readiness to see the country reduced rather than admit that the cause had failed. That answer is as morally damning as it is descriptively stark. It explains why Speer describes the moral horror he later felt, why ministers and technical staff found themselves engaging in subterfuge to preserve what they could, and why civilians felt abandoned by the promises that had once sustained them. It explains the actions that followed: selective compliance with demolition orders, the siphoning off of scarce resources for military ends, and the refusal in some instances to authorize mass evacuations. Above all, it explains the tone of finality present in the regime's last documents. a refusal to accept accountability that culminated in a leader's disappearance rather than a public reckoning. The human cost of that calculus is the essential, final indictment. Whether counted as the number of directly killed in the last months of fighting, the number displaced by the flight from the East, or the countless lives made brittle by hunger and exposure, the damage was multiplied because the state apparatus, rather than pivoting to preserve life in the face of defeat, embraced policies that allowed destruction to continue or even accelerate. When authority chooses ideological consistency over human survival, the moral arithmetic is simple and terrible: symbolic victory at the cost of concrete lives. What should be the lesson for us now? First, the historical record here underscores a political truth about concentrated power. When decision-making is centralized and insulated from the lived consequences of its policies, leaders can become capable of treating their own populace as expendable instruments of prestige or revenge. Second, systems that forbid dissent and filter information toward a curated reality make it easier for punitive ideas to become policy. Third, the moral responsibility of subordinates matters. Speer's technical objections, the small acts of local officials who delayed demolitions, and the quieter instincts of engineers and managers to preserve life demonstrate that individuals working within bureaucracies can blunt and sometimes reverse catastrophic directives. The titles promise that you would be surprised by what Hitler told Germans when they begged for peace rests not on a single epigrammatic sentence, but on the cumulative effect of words and deeds recorded by those who were there. He did not offer negotiation. He offered, according to the surviving documents, a logic that placed the denial of victory to the enemy above the preservation of the nation itself. That is an answer that shocks because it inverts the most basic expectation of leadership: that a sovereign will protect, or at least seek to protect, the lives and livelihoods of his people. Hitler's documented response, as preserved in Speer's accounts, Goebbels' diaries, and the operational orders of the regime, was instead to prioritize symbolic denial and punitive destruction, even when that meant asking of Germans more ruin than victory required. History, finally, is a discipline of cautious judgments grounded in documents and testimony. The sources do not support a trivializing summation nor a sensationalized caricature. They do, however, sustain a sober moral appraisal. In the last months of the Third Reich, the appeals of ordinary people for relief and peace met a leadership that increasingly chose ideological purity and punitive logic over concession and protection. That choice became policy, and policy became ruin for countless civilians. If this account has unsettled you, it should. The past matters because it warns us of what concentrated power, insulated from accountability, can do. The voices in Goebbels' files, the engineering tables in Speer's memoranda, the orders bearing the stamp of the Nero Decree, together they record a trajectory from hubris to vindictive ruin. They answer the question posed at the beginning: when Germans sought peace, what Hitler told them, through words and, more importantly, through orders, was effectively that he preferred to see the country's worth denied to the enemy rather than to accept defeat and preserve life. That is the historical truth that lies behind the headline, and it remains a cautionary tale about leaders who place ideology above people. For those who want to dig deeper, the description below lists primary sources and recommended reading, including the memoirs of Albert Speer, selections from Joseph Goebbels' diary entries, and collections of wartime directives that document the Nero Decree and related orders. Watch our next documentary examining the collapse of centralized authority and the human choices that mitigated or magnified state-inflicted ruin. Check the description for the source list and suggested books, and if you found this investigation meaningful, consider sharing it with someone who cares about the lessons history can teach us.